Harlem, New York. 2:34 p.m. Saturday, August 14, 1948. The afternoon heat pressed down on 125th Street like a wet blanket, turning the asphalt soft and the air thick with the smell of roasted peanuts, motor oil, and nervous sweat. The market was packed shoulder to shoulder, housewives in floral dresses haggling over catfish, children weaving between crates of melting ice, vendors shouting prices over the rumble of passing Chevrolet. It was chaos. It was crowded. It was the kind of place where a stranger could think he was invisible. Ruthie Johnson was 9 years old, wearing a yellow sundress her mother had pressed that morning. Her father had given her $3 to buy mackerel for dinner. She stood at Mrs. Patterson's fish stall, coins clutched in her small fist, when a man in a wrinkled gray suit stumbled through the crowd. He wasn't local. He didn't know the unwritten rules of 125th Street. He didn't know that certain children walked under an invisible shield of protection. Gerald Finch was 42 years old, a real estate investor from the Upper West Side who owned 4 tenement buildings in Harlem. He came up twice a month to collect rents, intimidate tenants, and pocket cash from families who could barely afford food. Today, he was drunk. Today, he was careless. Today, he made the mistake that would cost him everything. At 2:36 p.m., as Ruthie reached for her change, Finch's hand moved across her shoulder, deliberate, lingering. When she turned, confused, he smiled. Not embarrassed, not apologetic. He smiled like he owned the moment, like he knew no one would say a word. Then he leaned down and whispered something that made her freeze. "Pretty little thing," he muttered, his breath stale with whiskey. "Your people should be grateful anybody even notices you up here." The words dropped into the market like a stone into still water. A vendor stopped cutting fish. A woman, loading groceries, went silent. Eyes shifted. The noise didn't stop, but something underneath it changed. Within 90 seconds, a teenage boy was running 3 blocks north to the Palm Caf. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was sitting at his usual table, reading the Amsterdam News, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of him. The messenger was breathless. He said 6 words: "A white man touched Ruthie at Patterson's." Bumpy didn't ask questions. He folded the newspaper with mechanical precision. He stood. He adjusted his suit jacket. He walked toward the door. Behind him, conversation stopped. Phones started ringing. The machinery of Harlem's invisible government began to turn. At 2:41 p.m., 7 minutes after the violation, Bumpy arrived at the fish market. He didn't raise his voice. He asked Ruthie one question. What did he look like? She described the gray suit, the gold watch, the smell of whiskey. Bumpy nodded once. Then he stepped outside and raised a single hand in the air. The street stopped breathing. Shop owners began pulling down grates. Vendors packed up early. Cars stopped moving. Within 10 minutes, Bumpy Johnson had locked down 6 city blocks with a gesture. Gerald Finch was 3 blocks away, counting rent money outside a pawn shop, planning his evening. He had no idea he was already a dead man walking. The story of how Gerald Finch lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to August 14, 1948. In 1948, Harlem operated under 2 sets of laws. The official statutes belonged to New York City. The real authority belonged to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. On paper, the police controlled 6 square blocks of 125th Street. In reality, every vendor, every corner, every child walking to school existed under a different jurisdiction entirely. This was a fortress disguised as a marketplace, where protection was currency and respect was enforced with surgical precision. The ecosystem functioned like a living surveillance network. Mrs. Patterson sold fish from her corner stall, her scales honest, her eyes sharper. She memorized faces, tracked conversations, noted which strangers lingered too long near children. 3 stalls down, Marcus Webb ran numbers disguised as fruit sales, while his nephew watched for badges and unfamiliar license plates. The barber shop served as intelligence headquarters, where information moved faster than clippers across scalps. Mothers shopped with absolute confidence because invisible watchers tracked every interaction. Predators were identified, cataloged, and eliminated before they could strike twice. Everyone understood their role in the machine. Gerald Finch understood none of this. He was a parasite in a gray flannel suit who viewed Harlem as his personal collection territory. He owned 4 tenement buildings between 122nd and 127th Streets, each one a monument to systematic exploitation. His business model was brutal and efficient. Charged desperate families $70 monthly for apartments worth $40. Pocket security deposits and claim damage when tenants fled. Add $15 late fees 2 days after rent came due. Use racial slurs casually, knowing the legal system protected white property owners over black tenants with nowhere else to go. Every month, Finch made his rounds with absolute impunity. When Mrs. Etta Simmons fell behind on rent because her husband's factory cut his hours, Finch added penalties and called her family animals who should be grateful for shelter. When the Robinsons requested heating repairs in January, he laughed and suggested they burn furniture to stay warm. He carried a leather ledger where he recorded payments in red ink, his handwriting sharp and accusatory. The system was his weapon. Police ignored complaints from black tenants. Housing courts moved too slowly to matter. He operated with the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences. On August 14th, Finch pushed through the crowded market with drunken entitlement, his pockets heavy with extracted rent money. He saw obstacles, not people. Nuisances, not neighbors. When his hand moved across 9-year-old Ruthie Johnson's shoulder at Mrs. Patterson's fish stall, it was deliberate, possessive. When she turned, confused and frightened, he smiled with practiced cruelty and leaned close, his whiskey breath invading her space. "Pretty little thing," he muttered. "Your people should be grateful anybody even notices you up here." The words dropped into the market like stones into still water. Silence expanded outward in concentric circles. Mrs. Patterson's knife stopped mid-cut above a mackerel. A woman loading groceries went completely still. Eyes locked onto Finch with predatory focus. The invisible signals fired immediately. A nod from vendor to shoeshine boy. A glance from shopkeeper to payphone operator. Within 60 seconds, 3 messengers were running toward 3 different locations. At the Palm Calf, the phones began ringing before anyone had spoken Bumpy's name. The network was already mobilizing, the machinery of retribution awakening before its architect even knew why. At 2:38 p.m., the first call left the payphone beside the bakery, a hurried description delivered in coded fragments. Drunk white landlord, gray suit, gold watch, touched the Johnson girl. The receiver slammed down. Within 90 seconds, the machinery of retribution began its systematic activation. This was not chaos. This was a military operation executed by civilians who understood their roles with surgical precision. At 2:42 p.m., a delivery truck carrying soda crates stalled across the intersection at 125th and Lenox, the driver popping his hood to examine an engine that needed no examination. 2 blocks east, another truck blocked 126th Street. By 2:46 p.m., 4 major intersections were sealed without a single official barricade. Traffic slowed, then stopped completely. Drivers honked briefly before recognizing the faces watching from doorways and deciding silence was safer. The subway entrances became checkpoints. At the 125th Street station, 3 men in dark coats positioned themselves at the turnstiles, memorizing every face that emerged from underground. The network moved with terrifying efficiency. Newsstand operators folded their papers and became sentries, their eyes scanning 3 blocks in every direction. Shoeshine boys abandoned their boxes and took strategic positions at corners, their usual customers forgotten. Inside the Red Rooster bar, the bartender made coded phone calls while wiping down glasses, each conversation brief and specific. Within 8 minutes, 47 people were tracking one drunk white man in a gray suit. Harlem had transformed from neighborhood into cage. Gerald Finch noticed the change at 2:51 p.m. Standing outside a pawn shop counting rent money with greasy fingers, he realized the street had gone unnaturally quiet. The usual chaos of honking horns and shouting vendors had muted into something heavier, more suffocating. People were staring with calculation rather than curiosity. He looked for the familiar patrol car that circled this block twice hourly, the officers who accepted his bribes and ignored tenant complaints. The street was completely empty of badges. At 2:54 p.m., panic pricking at his neck, Finch flagged a yellow cab idling near the corner. The driver was broad-shouldered with scarred knuckles, a man named Thomas who owed Bumpy Johnson a 3-year-old favor. Finch slid into the back seat, barking an address in Midtown. Thomas nodded without speaking, pulled into traffic, and turned north instead. When Finch protested, the locks clicked shut. The cab rolled steadily through streets that had somehow cleared of obstacles, as if the entire city was parting to let them through. They stopped at 127th Street in front of a crumbling brownstone, Finch's own building. Confused but seeing opportunity, he climbed the steps to apartment 3B and pounded until Mrs. Etta Simmons answered. She was 71 years old with arthritis in both hands and a husband dying slowly in the bedroom behind her. Finch demanded $70 plus late fees. When she produced 12 crumpled bills from a coffee tin, her last money for groceries, he snatched them and threatened eviction within the week, making notes in red ink while she wept. At 3:11 p.m., Finch exited the building, pocketing Mrs. Simmons' $12. He descended the front steps and stopped. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat on the stoop alone, his charcoal suit pressed to knife-edge perfection. His hands rested calmly on his knees. His face showed nothing. No anger, no urgency, just the cold patience of a judge waiting for court to begin. Bumpy stood slowly, stepping directly into Finch's path. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You touched my daughter today." Finch's face cycled through confusion, recognition, then pure terror. He turned and ran. 4 steps. He made it exactly 4 steps before 2 men materialized from the shadows, their hands firm as they guided him toward a black Cadillac idling at the curb. Bumpy watched with cold satisfaction, adjusting his cufflinks as the car doors closed. The black Cadillac moved through empty streets with ceremonial slowness. Its engine, the only sound in 6 blocks of unnatural silence. Gerald Finch expected a warehouse, an alley, some dark corner where bodies disappeared without witnesses. Instead, at 3:24 p.m., the car stopped exactly where the violation had occurred, in the center of the market where vendors still stood at their stalls. Bumpy Johnson understood that private justice created fear, but public justice created legends. He needed every vendor, every mother, every child to witness the restoration of order. The door opened. Finch was guided out with mechanical efficiency, positioned in a wooden chair that appeared as if conjured from nowhere. Within minutes, a silent circle of perhaps 200 people surrounded him, their expressions controlled, their eyes cold. Vendors abandoned their scales. Shoppers halted mid-purchase. Mothers gripped their children's shoulders, not to shield them from what was coming, but to ensure they saw it clearly. The marketplace had transformed into a tribunal. This was not entertainment. This was education. Bumpy Johnson stepped into the center, positioning himself directly in front of Finch. He held a small leather notebook, not Finch's red ink ledger, but his own intelligence gathered over months. He did not raise his voice. He recited charges with the unemotional precision of a prosecutor reading to a jury. Gerald Finch. 4 buildings. 137 families. Apartment 3B, 127th Street, $70 charged for space worth $40. Security deposit stolen from the Robinson family. Apartment 2A, never returned despite no damages. Late fees added to Mrs. Washington's account 2 days before rent was due. Each accusation hit with surgical accuracy, documented evidence of systematic exploitation. The witnesses came forward without being summoned. Mrs. Etta Simmons stepped into the circle first, still clutching her empty coffee tin, describing how Finch had stolen her last $12 30 minutes earlier while her dying husband coughed blood in the next room. A young mother with 3 children clinging to her skirt explained how Finch had called her family animals when she begged for heat in January, how her youngest developed pneumonia in that frozen apartment. A decorated war veteran, standing tall despite his limp, recounted being called subhuman while Finch collected rent, how the slurs came as casually as breathing. Finch began to break. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by desperate bargaining. He offered cash from his pockets, promised to reduce rents, swore he would sell the buildings and never return. He reached for his wallet with shaking hands, pulling out bills and extending them toward Bumpy like offerings to an angry god. "I'll pay double," he stammered, sweat dripping onto his collar. "Whatever you want, just let me go." Bumpy let him finish. Then he spoke with surgical finality. "This isn't about money. This is about respect. You violated a child in my neighborhood. You humiliated families who had nowhere else to turn." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The system isn't here." The ultimatum was delivered without emotion. Finch would kneel before Ruthie Johnson and apologize in front of the entire community. He would transfer ownership of all 4 buildings to a trust for affordable housing. He would leave Harlem immediately and never return. These were the terms for mercy. Finch's face transformed. The fear drained away, replaced by something uglier. He laughed, a bitter sound that echoed across the silent market. Then he spat, the saliva landing near Bumpy's polished shoe. "I'll never kneel to no colored kid," he sneered, the slurs flowing like poison. "You people are nothing." Bumpy didn't blink. He simply nodded once, a small gesture that carried the weight of a signed execution order. He turned to his men, his voice calm and instructional. "Smart violence. Make it educational." Smart violence required precision, not passion. Bumpy Johnson understood that killing Gerald Finch would create a martyr and trigger investigations from downtown. But destroying him completely, methodically dismantling everything he had built through exploitation, that created something far more valuable than a corpse. That created a warning that would echo through every slumlord's office in New York City. At 3:41 p.m., Solomon Gray arrived carrying a leather briefcase that contained the instruments of legal warfare. Gray was Harvard Law class of 1932, a brilliant attorney who had abandoned corporate practice to serve Harlem's invisible government. He understood that the law was a weapon, and weapons required proper ammunition. He opened the briefcase on Mrs. Patterson's fish table and began extracting documents with surgical precision. Building code violations documented by paid inspectors over months of surveillance. Health department complaints signed by anonymous witnesses who had photographed rat infestations and broken plumbing. Fire safety infractions meticulously cataloged with dates and apartment numbers. Each document bore official stamps, each signature authentic or expertly forged by craftsmen who owed Bumpy their freedom. Gray made 4 phone calls to City Hall while Finch watched in growing horror, his voice professional and devastating. Emergency inspections were scheduled for Monday morning. Condemnation proceedings would begin Tuesday. By 3:52 p.m., Gerald Finch legally owned nothing but debt and liability. The system that had protected him was now consuming him from within. The physical education began immediately. 2 men held Finch's right hand flat against the wooden table. His dominant hand, the one that had signed eviction notices and counted blood money. Bumpy positioned himself directly in Finch's line of sight and opened his small notebook. He began reciting names with the methodical precision of a prosecutor reading charges. Mrs. Etta Simmons, apartment 3B, 71 years old, husband dying. The first finger snapped with a sound like breaking kindling. Finch screamed, but the circle of witnesses remained silent. The Robinson family, apartment 2A. 3 children, no heat in January. The second finger. The bone cracked clean. Mrs. Washington, apartment 4C, called animals by a man who steals from children. The third finger. Each name represented a family he had terrorized, each break a debt collected with interest compounded over years of humiliation. By the 4th finger, Finch was sobbing uncontrollably. By the 5th, his hand was a ruined collection of angles that would never hold a pen the same way again. This was not torture. This was accounting. Each broken bone a line item in a ledger of justice finely balanced. The economic execution proceeded simultaneously. Bumpy reached into Finch's jacket and removed the thick roll of cash collected that day, over $400 in rent money, extracted from desperate families. He didn't pocket it. He walked through the crowd methodically, calling victims forward by name, returning money that had been stolen through fabricated late fees and imaginary damages. Mrs. Simmons received her $12 plus $60 more for the months of overcharges. The young mother got $120 to cover heating for the winter. The war veteran received $85 in back payments for years of exploitation. Each transaction was witnessed, documented, made permanent in community memory. While the money changed hands, Gray continued his phone campaign. Finch's banking contacts received detailed warnings about impending litigation. His insurance brokers heard descriptions of criminal negligence and code violations. His business partners learned that association with Gerald Finch meant association with Harlem's wrath. By 4:15 p.m., Finch was radioactive in every business circle that mattered. The psychological warfare was more devastating than the physical pain. Finch was forced to watch his empire evaporate in real time as Gray produced forged ownership transfer documents, each bearing Finch's signature expertly replicated by a counterfeiter who owed Bumpy his life. The 4 buildings were being converted immediately into community-controlled affordable housing. Rents would be cut to $35 monthly. Families facing eviction received permanent protection. The apartments Finch had weaponized were being transformed into sanctuaries before his eyes. By 4:28 p.m., Finch understood completely. This wasn't random brutality or street justice. This was systematic destruction of everything he had built through decades of exploitation. He begged now with genuine desperation, offering information about other landlords, promising cooperation with any demand, anything to stop the dismantling of his existence. His voice cracked with the understanding that he was being erased, not just financially, but socially, professionally, completely. Bumpy leaned close, his words delivered with surgical coldness. "You're going to walk out of here and tell them what happens when you touch one of ours." As they prepared to release the broken man, movement flashed in the periphery. Marcus, a 23-year-old crew member with burning eyes and something to prove, stepped forward from the circle. An ice pick glinted in his palm, the metal catching the late afternoon sun. He moved toward Finch with clear, lethal intention, ready to finish what Mercy had left incomplete. The entire market froze. Bumpy's next decision would determine whether this became a message or a martyrdom. Marcus moved with lethal intention, the ice pick glinting in his palm as he stepped toward Finch's broken form. Bumpy's hand cut through the air, intercepting the young man's wrist with absolute authority. The weapon froze inches from Finch's throat. "Dead men tell no tales," Bumpy said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of calculated strategy. "Broken men become legends." He took the ice pick from Marcus's trembling grip, examining the tool briefly before slipping it into his own jacket. This wasn't about satisfying bloodlust. This was about creating a message that would travel into rooms where his voice would never reach, carried by a messenger who could speak from personal experience about the cost of crossing Harlem's invisible boundaries. At 4:47 p.m., they loaded Finch into the Cadillac for his final journey. The car moved south through streets that had returned to normal operation. Vendors resuming their calls, mothers continuing their shopping, the lockdown dissolving as efficiently as it had materialized. They drove toward 110th Street, the historic boundary where Harlem ended and white-controlled Manhattan began. The car stopped beneath the elevated train tracks at 111th Street, neutral ground where both worlds could witness what happened when sacred lines were violated. This location was chosen with surgical precision, a place where Finch's own people would find him quickly enough to save his life, but slowly enough to absorb the full meaning of his condition. The final brutality was applied with mathematical precision, each blow calculated to maximize permanent damage while avoiding guaranteed death. They shattered his left kneecap with a single strike from a tire iron, ensuring he would limp for the remainder of his days, every step a reminder of August 14, 1948. His jaw was broken on the right side, not enough to kill but sufficient to slur his speech permanently, to make every racial slur he might attempt sound like the pathetic mumbling of a broken man. The orbital bone around his left eye was fractured carefully, leaving him with vision but marking his face forever. This was smart violence, surgical in its application, designed to announce its message in every mirror, every handshake, every attempt to return to the life he had known before he touched Bumpy Johnson's daughter. When the physical education was complete, Bumpy produced a small white card and his fountain pen. He knelt beside Finch's broken form and wrote with deliberate precision, each letter perfectly formed despite the violence surrounding him. The message was brief and absolute. Touch one of ours, and we touch all of you. He pinned the card to Finch's blood-stained shirt with a brass tack, positioning it directly over the heart like a military decoration. Then they left him there, breathing but broken, slumped against the brick wall for his own people to discover within the hour. By Sunday morning, the newspapers had sanitized everything with practiced efficiency. The New York Times ran nothing. The Daily News buried 6 lines on page 17 about an assault near 111th Street. Victim's name withheld. Investigation ongoing. But in back rooms where real power operated, white landlords and police captains read between the lines with perfect clarity. They understood the geography, noted the professional precision of the injuries, recognized the signature of systematic justice. Phone calls were made. Meetings were quietly rescheduled. Rent collection policies were reviewed with sudden urgency. The invisible line of respect that Harlem had been demanding for decades was now visible, enforced not by law, but by the understanding that certain violations would be answered with complete destruction. Inside Harlem, the atmosphere shifted with quiet satisfaction. Mothers walked 125th Street with different posture. Their children held closer but with less fear. Vendors stood straighter behind their scales, understanding that the marketplace was protected territory. The story spread through barbershops and church basements in fragments and knowing glances rather than newspaper headlines. 3 days later, Gerald Finch limped into the 28th precinct with his lawyer, demanding arrests, naming names, describing kidnapping and systematic assault. The desk sergeant listened with professional politeness, then closed his notebook with deliberate finality. "Sounds like a property dispute, Mr. Finch. Civil matter." The message was unmistakable. The 28th precinct knew better than to investigate Bumpy Johnson over a slumlord who had finally faced consequences the legal system would never deliver. The destruction of Gerald Finch unfolded with the methodical precision of a surgical procedure, each cut designed to sever another connection to the life he had built through exploitation. By September 1948, his wife Catherine had filed for separation, unable to reconcile the confident businessman she married with the limping, mumbling wreck who flinched at sudden movements and spoke in slurred fragments through his broken jaw. She took their children to her sister's home in Connecticut, leaving behind only divorce papers and the smell of expensive perfume that would never again mask the stench of his humiliation. His business reputation crumbled faster than his bones had healed. Banks called in loans with suspicious timing. Insurance companies canceled policies citing high-risk management practices. By November, bankruptcy consumed what remained, leaving him with legal fees and medical bills for surgeries that could repair cartilage but never restore standing. The ripple effects reached into rooms where real power concentrated. Police Commissioner Wallander received carefully worded memos questioning how a private citizen could lock down 6 city blocks without generating a single arrest report. Detectives who had previously ignored Bumpy's operations now parked unmarked cars outside the Palm Caf, documenting faces, recording license plates, mapping the invisible government that had executed justice the legal system couldn't deliver. Downtown, federal agents made exploratory visits, asking careful questions about organized crime structures in predominantly black neighborhoods. The attention was unwelcome but manageable, another cost of protecting territory through methods bureaucrats could never acknowledge or control. More dangerous were the tensions with established crime families who viewed Bumpy's public display as threatening precedent. The Italian syndicates controlling Lower Manhattan sent diplomatic messages through intermediaries expressing concern that such visible assertions of power might attract federal scrutiny, damaging to everyone's operations. They didn't appreciate Black Harlem demonstrating this level of organized control, didn't like the implications of a parallel sovereignty operating with surgical efficiency. Bumpy navigated these tensions with calculated diplomacy, reassuring nervous allies that the Finch situation was isolated, a matter of family protection rather than territorial expansion. But privately, he understood the message had been received exactly as intended. This duality defined his existence with perfect, dangerous symmetry. To mothers shopping on 125th Street, he was the guardian who made their children's safety absolute. To numbers runners and policy bankers, he was the architect of illegal enterprises generating thousands weekly. These roles weren't contradictory, they reinforced each other with mathematical precision. Criminal operations funded the protection network. Community protection provided loyalty that made criminal enterprises untouchable. The 4 seized buildings became monuments to this paradox, converted to affordable housing where families paid $35 monthly while Bumpy's gambling operations continued 3 blocks away, both sides of the same carefully minted coin. In October 1948, driven by desperation or stubborn arrogance, Finch made one final catastrophic mistake. He entered a diner on 123rd Street at 11:47 a.m., carrying a briefcase and wearing a cheap suit, perhaps believing enough time had passed. The reaction was immediate and terrifyingly silent. Within 90 seconds, customers abandoned half-eaten meals. The cook disappeared. A waiter approached with coffee he hadn't ordered, setting the cup down with mechanical calm. Beneath the saucer lay a folded note in familiar handwriting. Last chance. Finch stared at the words for 30 seconds, his hands trembling until coffee rattled against ceramic. He left the briefcase behind and walked out. By November, he had relocated to Philadelphia, disappearing into anonymity, never setting foot in New York again. The buildings on 127th Street stood as physical proof that in Harlem, the most effective government wasn't elected but enforced. In 1963, a journalist researching organized crime interviewed Ruthie Johnson, then a schoolteacher. When asked about that August afternoon, her response captured the entire contradiction of her father's power. She looked directly at the reporter and said, "I never saw what my father did, but I never had to. I just knew I was safe." The story of Gerald Finch transformed into something more powerful than history could ever be. In barbershops across Lenox Avenue and on street corners where old men gathered to educate the young, the incident evolved into modern parable, each retelling polishing the details until they gleamed like carefully cut gems. They spoke of how Bumpy stopped time itself on August 14th, how traffic lights seemed to freeze on red, how the very air in Harlem grew heavy with the weight of impending justice. But this wasn't mere embellishment. These men understood that mythology served a function history books never could. When new landlords or ambitious outsiders tested boundaries, someone would lean close and whisper, "You don't want to end up like Finch." The name became shorthand for a specific kind of destruction, total and systematic, yet completely avoidable if one simply understood the unwritten rules governing respect in Black Harlem. This transformation from incident to instruction revealed the fundamental architecture of real power. While historians examining organized crime obsess over flashy violence, the dramatic shootouts and public executions that photograph well and sell books, they miss the essential truth that authentic authority was constructed through moments exactly like the Finch affair. Systematic demonstrations of protection created loyalty deeper than fear alone could manufacture. Bumpy Johnson grasped what academics studying from comfortable distance never could. Communities don't pledge allegiance to the man who kills most efficiently, but to the guardian who makes their children safe when the legal system refuses to intervene. The lockdown of 6 city blocks, the public tribunal, the surgical destruction of a predator, these weren't criminal acts but governmental functions performed by the only authority willing to enforce standards the official government ignored. The fish market on 125th Street remained protected territory long after Bumpy's death from a heart attack in 1968, proof that he had built something more durable than personal power. Vendors who witnessed the Finch trial passed responsibility to their children and grandchildren, maintaining invisible surveillance networks that tracked threats before they materialized. Even as the neighborhood changed, as drugs replaced numbers and new gangs replaced old organizations, a lingering aura of protection clung to those specific blocks. Mothers continued shopping with absolute confidence decades later, not because police patrols increased or laws changed, but because the understanding established on that August afternoon had become permanent infrastructure. It was a space where the memory of enforcement was so strong it continued to regulate behavior long after its architect was buried. Ruthie Johnson carried the weight of that day differently, as she grew into a woman of quiet dignity. She became a schoolteacher, dedicating her life to educating children in the same neighborhoods her father had protected through methods she could never acknowledge in professional settings. She rarely spoke publicly about him, understanding that the world saw a criminal while she remembered a guardian, that certain truths were too complex for journalists seeking simple narratives about victims and villains. But privately, in quiet moments with trusted friends, she would describe the duality with perfect clarity. He was both the man who ran illegal gambling operations and the guardian who made her childhood safe in ways the police commissioner never could. In her classroom, she demanded absolute respect, enforcing rules with calm authority that reminded older colleagues of the man who once locked down 6 city blocks for her honor. The photograph allegedly taken of Finch's broken body vanished into history, likely destroyed by a man desperate to forget his own humiliation. But the text of the note, that simple, brutal message pinned to his shirt, achieved immortality. "Touch one of ours, and we touch all of you," circulated for decades on handwritten cards, appeared in graffiti on tenement stairwells, was quoted by younger leaders who sought to claim Bumpy's mantle. It became a motto for community self-defense, a declaration that vulnerability was not permission for exploitation. The phrase transformed from specific threat into general principle governing interactions across racial and economic boundaries, proof that words backed by demonstrated consequences could outlive the man who wrote them. The nature of respect in mid-20th century Harlem was never negotiable, never optional, enforced with surgical precision by men who understood that without it, their community would be devoured by predators with property deeds and police connections. This wasn't lawlessness, but parallel law, a shadow government administering consequences that courtrooms refused to deliver. Respect wasn't a courtesy, but currency more stable than the dollar, a form of protection more reliable than any legal statute. The official system protected property. Bumpy's government protected people. The Finch incident established rules of engagement that echoed through conflicts for decades afterward, creating precedent that both protected and constrained. It taught outsiders that while they might own the buildings, they did not own the people inside them. When predatory landlords in the 1950s proposed mass evictions, they found entire blocks suddenly united, organized with discipline that traced back to networks Bumpy had built. When police beat teenagers on nearby streets, the response wasn't chaotic riot, but targeted economic boycotts planned with tactical precision. The legacy wasn't the violence itself, but the clarity it provided, stripping away pretense that legal authority equaled moral authority, demonstrating that power belonged to those willing to exercise it with absolute conviction. In 1948, a stranger made a mistake in a crowded market. He thought children were defenseless. He learned that in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, every child walked under the protection of a man who turned respect into a weapon and disrespect into a death sentence.